They fined me $500 for fishing with my daughter. No warning, no conversation, just a cold letter taped to my door and another nasty email from the HOA president saying I'd violated community standards. But it wasn't about fish. It was about control. A power-hungry board led by a woman who thought she could bully new residents into silence. So I did the only thing I could think of. I bought the entire lake. And then I rewrote the rules. What started as a simple act of defiance turned into a full-blown war for the soul of our neighborhood. She tried to shut me out. She tried to humiliate my family. But what she didn't know was that I had a plan. A ruthless one. You're about to hear how one HOA president lost everything, her power, her influence, and her entire reputation, all because she messed with the wrong fisherman. If you love true revenge stories that expose twisted power plays and sweet payback, hit that subscribe button. Trust me, you don't want to miss what happens next. Until recently, I had no idea a $5 fishing lure could cost me $1,000 in HOA fines. It was a crisp Saturday morning in early spring, and my son Jonah and I were out by the lake. We'd moved into the Alder Point community just 6 weeks earlier, looking for quiet, for peace, for something that resembled a second chance after the last few years tore our lives apart. Jonah had just turned 13. It had been a rough birthday. His mother, my wife, passed away from a sudden aneurysm less than a year ago. The grief was like a silent alarm, always ticking in the background. The only thing that ever seemed to quiet it was water, stillness, and the simple joy of fishing. It had been our family ritual, mine, Jonah's, and hers. That morning, Jonah was sitting at the edge of the dock with a borrowed rod in hand, his sneakers half drenched from a misstep, laughing like I hadn't heard him laugh in months. He was telling me some half-finished story about a science teacher when his line twitched. A second later, a silver flash broke the surface. "Dad, got one!" A bluegill, not big, but enough to light up his whole face. I smiled. Careful, real slow, let it fight. But before he could land it, the moment was interrupted. A voice, sharp, nasal, and painfully entitled, snapped through the morning like a whip. "Excuse me, you can't fish here." We both turned. A woman in a perfectly pressed white tracksuit stood on the gravel path behind us, holding a clipboard like it was a weapon. Her platinum blonde hair was pulled into a tight bun. Her eyebrows didn't move when she spoke. "This is a violation of community regulations. Fishing is strictly prohibited in Alder Point Lake." I stood slowly, placing myself between her and Jonah, who immediately looked down, suddenly embarrassed. "Sorry, I didn't see any signs," I said calmly. "Our realtor told us fishing was fine. Sure, and the sales brochure even showed a kid with a rod, right there, next to the lake." "The brochure is outdated. The board passed a resolution last month. All residents were notified." I already knew what this was. Not enforcement, not protection, not community. This was control, a performance. I dealt with people like her before, in boardrooms, in business, in politics. "I'm Cassandra Veers," she said, eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. "HOA president." "I'm Eli Mercer," I replied, offering a handshake she didn't take. "We just moved into 47 Willow Lane." "Then I suggest you read the handbook. Fishing here is a $500 violation, and since this is your first offense—" She paused, smiling like a shark. "The fine is $750. Jonah's face fell. I could see him retreating, guilt crashing in, just like it had after the funeral. That's when something inside me shifted. She didn't just ruin a father-son moment. She relit the fuse I'd spent a year trying to snuff out. We hadn't planned on moving to Alder Point. Truth is, we hadn't planned on moving anywhere. Before all this, I was the managing partner at a venture capital firm in Chicago. Long hours, endless flights, big checks. My wife, Rachel, was a public school teacher, biology mostly. She was the soul in our marriage. I was the engine. We made it work, until we didn't. Her aneurysm hit without warning. One minute we were planning Jonah's birthday trip to Yellowstone. The next, I was standing in a hospital room staring at machines that had already stopped mattering. I unraveled. Quietly, of course. Men like me don't fall apart publicly. I left the firm within a month, sold the penthouse, pulled Jonah out of his private school. He didn't complain. We both just stopped pretending. I started looking for something else, a different kind of life, something small, manageable, maybe even peaceful. That's how we ended up in Alder Point, a picturesque little lakeside community 2 hours outside the city, complete with manicured lawns, polite neighbors, and the kind of quiet that feels borrowed from a postcard. The real estate agent called it quaint luxury, the kind of place where kids can be kids and families can breathe again. That's what I wanted for Jonah, for myself, a clean slate, some space to grieve, to heal. And at first, it worked. The lake was the centerpiece of the community, a shallow, sprawling body of water with a single dock, a gazebo, and willow trees that bowed like they were whispering secrets. Jonah loved it immediately. It reminded him of the summer trips we used to take to his grandparents' cabin. We were settling in, until Cassandra Veers and her clipboard arrived. And that $750 fine wasn't the end of it. 2 days later, we got a second notice, this time for a non-conforming mailbox. Then came the landscaping citation. Then a warning for leaving our garbage cans out for 7 extra minutes after pickup. The violations weren't just aggressive, they were personal. I did some digging. It turned out the HOA board was made up of 6 people, all of whom had lived in Alder Point for over a decade. 5 of them were close friends. All of them were retirees with a lot of time on their hands. Cassandra was the queen bee, no doubt about it. The bylaws gave her wide discretion. Selective enforcement was the name of the game. But the kicker, the lake, the very one she fined us for fishing in, didn't even belong to the HOA. Not technically. It was leased land, owned by a small, struggling development company that hadn't completed Phase 2 of the neighborhood after the 2008 crash. As far as I could tell, no one had ever questioned it. Most residents assumed the lake was part of the HOA's assets. Cassandra made sure they thought that, and she wielded that illusion like a sword. It was petty tyranny, and I've never been good at letting petty tyrants win. The second fishing fine came with a note taped to my door. Not mailed, not emailed, not placed in the box. Taped to my door, in bold marker, per HOA code, SARI 8.4.7. Unauthorized recreational use of common area. Final warning. Cassandra's handwriting. Neat. Cold. Underlined twice. This wasn't just about Jonah casting a line off the dock. It wasn't about fish or permits or policy. It was about control. That same evening, as Jonah sat silently at the dinner table picking at his food, I stared out the window at the lake. The water was calm, still. The reflection of the moon rippled slightly near the dock, the same dock where my son had laughed for the first time in months, and I realized this wasn't just a fine. This was a line being drawn. I went to bed early, but I didn't sleep. Instead, I pulled out my laptop and started digging. The lake's ownership. It took less than 15 minutes to trace the lake's ownership through county records. Technically, the land and the water belonged to Maplebrook Development Group, a company that hadn't built a single thing in over a decade. Their last annual filing showed dwindling assets and outstanding debt obligations. Their office was a P.O. box. Their last active project, Alder Point Phase 2, canceled after the 2009 crash. No one had bought the lake. No one had rezoned it, and most importantly, no one had transferred control of it to the HOA. In fact, the recreational use agreement between Maplebrook and Alder Point's HOA had expired 3 years ago. Expired and never renewed. Legally, Cassandra Veers had no right to restrict access to the lake. Not to me, not to anyone. But she'd been bluffing so long, no one had called her on it. Until now. The broken pattern, fueled by equal parts rage and curiosity, I started asking questions. Quietly. I struck up conversations with neighbors, the ones who didn't show up at every HOA event, the ones who seemed quieter. What I heard was chilling. A veteran fined repeatedly for building a wheelchair ramp without pre-approval. A single mother whose kids were banned from the pool for being disruptive. A black family cited for non-standard exterior decor after hanging a wind chime. A gay couple fined for painting their shutters navy blue, even though a straight couple on the next block had the exact same color. Every story followed a pattern. Enforcement through intimidation. Fines used as weapons. rules that bent for some and broke others. Cassandra wasn't running an HOA. She was running a kingdom. And I don't like kings. The HOA doesn't run on democracy. It runs on apathy. Most people just want peace, a quiet life, maybe a pool in the summer and lights at Christmas. They'll pay the fees, they'll trim the lawn, they'll nod along, but they won't fight. Cassandra Veers knew this. She'd turned that silence into a weapon. But I wasn't interested in silence. I wanted the truth. And now I had a trail to follow. Step 1. Dissect the bylaws. I started with the governing documents, 3 PDFs totaling over 200 pages, covenants, conditions restrictions, CCRs, architectural guidelines, and the operating manual for the HOA. Most residents had never read them. Cassandra was counting on that, but I had, twice. Here's what stood out. Article 9, Section 3.1. The HOA had no legal authority to enforce rules on land not deeded to it or placed under formal recreational easement. Article 12, Section 5.4. Any special rule or fine must be approved by a 2/3 majority of the voting members at an open meeting. Appendix C. The lake was listed as a shared amenity with use dependent on active easement agreements, which, as I had already confirmed, had expired 3 years ago. Translation? The HOA had no current legal claim to control that lake, no authority to issue fishing fines, no right to bar access, and certainly no justification for harassing my son. The house of cards was already tilting. Step 2. Follow the money. If Cassandra couldn't legally enforce rules on the lake, why was she so determined to control it? That answer came courtesy of a name I recognized buried in an old HOA newsletter. Maplebrook Development Group, the original developers of Alder Point. A friend of mine, a real estate analyst back in Chicago, helped me dig through property records and bankruptcy filings. What we found made my skin crawl. Maplebrook had defaulted on several of its assets during TOS. 2009 collapse, but they still retained certain titles. The lake was one of them, but their debts had been quietly purchased by a holding company just 6 months ago. That company? Vantage Rise Holdings, LLC. And guess who Vantage Rise was linked to? Cassandra's nephew, Dylan Veers. No official connection on paper, just layers of LLCs and paper trails. But the real link was obvious. Cassandra was orchestrating a quiet acquisition of the lake property through a family shell company and trying to push the HOA to fund its maintenance in the meantime. The fines were a smokescreen. The real goal was full ownership, control, and eventually, development. Luxury lakefront homes, private docks, restricted access, high-dollar real estate flips, all under her control, sold through her brother's real estate firm. It wasn't about community. It was about cash and legacy and ego. Step 3. Connect with the right allies. I couldn't do this alone. So I reached out to the 2 most dangerous people to a corrupt HOA, an ex-board member with a grudge, a board municipal clerk with access to public records. The former, a retired engineer named George Patel, had been forced off the board a year earlier after opposing one of Cassandra's pet projects, the $80,000 Lakeside Beautification Initiative, which conveniently awarded a no-bid contract to her cousin's landscaping firm. George still had his old board emails. He sent me PDF after PDF. Most were dull, but 2 stood out. A thread showing Cassandra pressuring other board members to approve lake-related fines, even without renewed agreements. A message titled, "Keep eyes on that new guy," with my name in bold, and the chilling line, "If he pushes back again, we use the clause. Find something on his property, anything." They were targeting me deliberately. As for the municipal clerk, a nice woman named Janice, she confirmed what I'd feared. Cassandra had already submitted a zoning variance application with the town council, one that would allow limited residential development along the lake perimeter. She wasn't just trying to take the lake, she was trying to rewrite the landscape of the entire town. Conclusion: now I knew the game, and more importantly, I knew the stakes. This wasn't a petty HOA spat anymore. This was land acquisition, development fraud, abuse of power, corruption stitched into the very soil of Alder Point. But Cassandra Veers had made one mistake. She assumed I was just another homeowner. She didn't know I'd spent a decade in private equity, dissecting crumbling companies and buying out distressed assets at fire sale prices. She didn't know I had capital. She didn't know I had patience. And she definitely didn't know that the lake she was scheming to own was already within my reach. All I had to do was wait and strike. The thing about people like Cassandra Veers is, they only see threats that scream. They're blind to the ones that whisper. So I made myself very, very quiet. The first step was making sure she never saw me coming. If Cassandra suspected, even for a second, that I was the one circling the lake property, she'd turn every HOA resource against me. She'd stall, interfere with permits, lean on her friends at city council. That meant I needed a mask, an identity with no traceable connection to me. I formed an LLC under the name Sable Creek Holdings, registered it out of Delaware, the capital of legal anonymity. On paper, it was just another passive investment group. No direct ties to me, no local footprint, no social media breadcrumbs, just clean, faceless corporate interest. Then I hired a real estate attorney out of Denver, neutral territory. She'd never heard of Lake Sedge, never tangled with a Veers or her HOA squad, and most importantly, had no reason to ask questions. I gave her one job: represent the LLC, approach Vantage Rise Holdings, the out-of-state firm that technically still owned the lake property. Submit an offer, $450,000, cash, no financing, 7-day close, no contingencies, no drama. The attorney's only response was a simple, understood, exactly what I needed. While she moved silently toward the purchase, I waited for the moment to strike publicly. Cassandra had just pushed a new budget through the HOA board, a sneaky amenity stabilization fee that tacked an extra $35 a month onto every homeowner's dues. She claimed it was for long-term lake preservation, but the community saw through it. The truth was, she was trying to build a war chest. Her endgame was obvious: take full control of the lake, then develop it, private docks, gated access, maybe even a lakeside spa for exclusive residents. Fishing? Gone. Access? Restricted. And families like mine, pushed to the fringe. Her mistake was underestimating how quickly resentment spreads when it's dressed in mandatory fees. Within a week, she'd been forced to schedule a town hall meeting to address the backlash. She prepped slides, renderings, buzzwords. She wanted to sell a dream. She had no idea it was already dead. The night of the meeting, while Cassandra stood in front of a crowd trying to charm them with pictures of gazebos and pastel paddle boats, my attorney called. The seller had accepted the offer. The property was mine, pending a routine environmental review, already fast-tracked by my team. I had legally secured the lake and the 10-foot perimeter of land around it. The ink hadn't dried yet, but functionally, she'd just given a sales pitch for a future she no longer controlled. I didn't show up at the meeting. I didn't speak, didn't post a thing online. Cassandra thought her plan was still intact. She thought the HOA was behind her. She thought the lake was hers. Let her think that for a few more days. Because if you really want to break someone like her, not just stop her, but shatter the illusion of control she's built her entire life around, you don't argue. You let her talk, let her gloat, let her climb to the very top of her imagined empire. And then, just when she thinks she's untouchable, you cut the ground out from beneath her and watch it all collapse. The days following the purchase were almost meditative. Every morning, I'd sip coffee from my porch and watch Cassandra strut around the lakefront like a self-appointed queen, barking orders to maintenance crews, waving at residents as if her benevolence built the shoreline. I smiled to myself each time. She had no idea she was trespassing on my land. Not HOA land, not city land, mine. She had doubled down after the town hall, emboldened by the absence of any real pushback. An email was circulated by the HOA board. Plans were moving forward for Phase 1 of the Lakeside Enhancement Project. It included landscaped gardens, new lighting, a boat rental shed, and a restricted access dock system. Construction would begin pending final acquisition negotiations with Vantage Rise Holdings. I printed that email and framed it, because 4 days earlier I'd already signed the final paperwork. Vantage had cashed the wire. The lake was off their books, out of Cassandra's reach, and sitting safely under the protection of Sable Creek Holdings. My LLC, my name. Now it was time to make the first ripple. I started small. A sign, white, professionally printed, posted at the lake's main entrance. It read, "Private property. Access limited to permitted users. Trespassing will be enforced." That was it. No explanation, no owner's name, just authority in black Helvetica font. The reaction was swift. The community Facebook page exploded within hours. Photos of the signs circulated like wildfire. Confused residents asked why the HOA hadn't announced this. Cassandra, clearly blindsided, responded with forced calm. "This is likely a misunderstanding with the sellers. We're in the final stages of our agreement and will address it promptly." I almost felt bad for her. Almost. That weekend, I installed security cameras, 4 total, mounted discreetly on trees around the lake perimeter. Cassandra's spies noticed, of course, and the rumors grew louder. Something had gone wrong. The HOA's silence stretched longer than anyone expected. The board meetings became tense. Her allies whispered in corners, unsure if she still had control. And then came the blow. My attorney sent a cease and desist letter to the HOA, formally notifying them that the lake and surrounding land were now private property under new ownership. Any use of the lake, any attempt to modify, construct, or grant access without written permission would be considered trespassing and prosecuted accordingly. It was addressed to the HOA board, but I made sure it reached every mailbox in the community as well. You could hear the collective gasp. Cassandra held an emergency board meeting that night. She was visibly shaken. Residents demanded answers. Why weren't we told the deal fell through? Why is someone else controlling the lake? What happened to the enhancement plan? Cassandra tried to spin it, claimed the sale was illegitimate, that legal action was being explored. She never admitted the truth. She had no idea the sale even happened until the letter arrived. Merrick called me the next day, laughing so hard he could barely get the words out. "She's losing it, man. She asked the board if they could reverse a land transfer retroactively. That's not even a thing." The next move was mine. I waited another 48 hours, just enough for the panic to bake in, then dropped the hammer. A letter on Sable Creek Holdings letterhead was hand-delivered to every home. It was polite, formal, and it made one thing crystal clear. Effective immediately, all recreational access to the lake is suspended until further notice. No parties, no fishing, no paddleboarding, no nothing. For the first time in a decade, Cassandra Veers had no control, and the real fun was just beginning. The fallout was immediate. By dusk, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. Kids stared longingly at the dock from behind the newly installed chain-link barrier. Weekend paddleboarders packed up and left in silence. And Cassandra, oh, Cassandra, spent most of her afternoon pacing in front of the lake entrance like a general without a battlefield. She tried to bluster, of course. She cornered a group of neighbors that evening and loudly proclaimed that my so-called ownership was a sham. "These things don't happen overnight," she insisted. "We're working with the city to get it reversed. It's a legal gray area." She tried to sound confident, but the cracks were visible. Her voice shook. Her hands were restless. The Queen was cornered, and the court was watching. Merrick, Samuel, and I met that night at my place. We sat at the kitchen island while Sen worked on her laptop upstairs, headphones on, unaware of the quiet war building just outside her window. "She's rattled," Merrick said, sipping black coffee, "and she's going to make mistakes." Samuel nodded. "She'll either try to force a vote to reclaim the lake or claim the HOA has some kind of legal override. But she doesn't. The deed's ironclad." "Then let's push her," I said. "Let's make her overreach, publicly." The next morning, I posted a formal notice at the lake entrance. "The property is undergoing ecological review and restoration. Any access without written permission will result in trespassing charges." That same day, I scheduled 3 things: a full environmental survey by a respected conservation group, a press briefing with the local paper, a neighborhood coffee event on my driveway, strictly invite only. I wasn't just taking back the lake, I was reclaiming the narrative, and Cassandra couldn't stand it. 3 days later, HOA letters began appearing in residents' mailboxes. They aimed at any homeowner who supported or engaged with unauthorized private property initiatives would be subject to fines and community disciplinary review. Merrick received one just for standing by the lake gate with me the day before. It was a bluff, a loud, desperate one, and people were starting to notice. More neighbors came to me in private, whispered thank yous, stories of Cassandra's selective rule enforcement, flags removed without warning, decorations called visual clutter, guests turned away from the pool. She'd ruled with intimidation for years, and now that her grasp was slipping, they were ready to talk. Then came the kicker. The environmental survey report returned, and it was damning, not against me, but the HOA. Excess fertilizer runoff, poorly maintained drainage systems, and even evidence that a contractor hired by the HOA had illegally dumped landscaping waste into the lake's northern cove. The lake had been deteriorating for years under Cassandra's watch, all while she used conservation concerns as a way to shut down fishing and boating. I made the report public. It went viral on the neighborhood app. Dozens of residents began reposting it, sharing their own experiences, and calling for transparency. Cassandra tried to discredit the findings, but the organization behind the study had a long-standing reputation. Her denials only made her look guiltier. By the end of that week, the HOA board was in chaos. One member resigned, another stopped responding to emails altogether. Cassandra doubled down, threatening lawsuits against me for damaging the community's reputation, but I was already 5 steps ahead. My attorney filed a cease and desist in return, this time citing defamation, misuse of authority, and harassment. Cassandra had started a war to control the lake. I'd taken the lake, and now I was coming for the system that let her rue. Lee unchecked. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been living under fog, and the light was finally breaking through. Every thread we pulled from Cassandra's tight little web unraveled something bigger. The resignation of 2 more board members sent shockwaves through the community. One of them, an older man named Ron Hastings, came to me quietly one evening. She told us it was for the good of the neighborhood, he said, staring at the lake as twilight settled. I believed her. I thought the restrictions were about order, pride. I never realized it was all just leverage. I said nothing, just nodded. That was enough. The guilt on his face was already punishment enough. Within days, I issued another statement, not a threat, not a boast, just clarity. I posted it on the bulletin board, the HOA website, and the neighborhood group. A public commitment that Rachel's Lake, yes, I'd renamed it after my late wife, would remain accessible for the community under a new agreement, but only when the HOA adopted a transparent charter, term limits, and an independent ethics committee. There would be no negotiations with the current board, not while Cassandra sat at the head. That's when she snapped. She sent out a mass email accusing me of seizing community assets, of corrupting public trust, and most laughably, of endangering children with unsanctioned lake activity. She invoked obscure safety ordinances, claimed my security patrols were illegal, and tried to paint me as a rogue outsider trying to buy influence. But I didn't have to fight back. The community did it for me. Diana Winters, a quiet single mom who'd once been cited for non-compliant garden gnomes, shared photos of Cassandra's own yard, cluttered with a half-dozen HOA-prohibited ornaments. Maria Gonzalez posted a timeline of every warning and fine she'd received, each one dated shortly after public disagreements with Cassandra. And James Morris, the retired schoolteacher, finally brought out the letter he'd received 2 years ago, calling him a visual disturbance to property values after he installed a wheelchair ramp for his wife. One by one, the ghosts of her petty tyranny lined up for reckoning. The HOA emergency meeting she called was supposed to be her power move. She stood there, smug behind the lectern, reciting bylaws and threatening fines with that same clipped tone she'd used for years. But this time, the room was silent, not with fear, but with seething quiet. Then, Sapphira Dusklund, of all people, stood. I moved to suspend Cassandra Peterson from her duties pending a full audit of HOA actions taken under her leadership. Silence. Then Ron Hastings stood up too. I second the motion. Cassandra froze. You can't do this. This is against the charter. You don't have the authority. Neither did you when you declared a private lake a restricted HOA asset, Sapphira said calmly. The vote was held right there in the clubhouse. It wasn't even close. As she stormed out, muttering threats and lawsuits under her breath, I watched her with a strange sense of pity. For all her cruelty and manipulation, she believed she was untouchable. She thought the HOA shielded her from consequence, but it never did. It was always paper armor, and now it had burned. In the following weeks, I worked with Merrick and Samuel to help rebuild what she'd nearly destroyed. We proposed a full redraft of the HOA charter, transparent elections, rotating leadership, and a firm community-first code of ethics. Sapphira, once meek and apologetic, was unanimously elected interim president. She declined the title, choosing instead to be called Chair of the Community Council. She wanted it to feel like the people's table, not a throne. The new access agreement to Rachel's Lake was signed within a week. Free access for all residents, open hours posted, environmental guidelines respected, and most importantly, zero influence from the HOA board. I never wanted power, I just wanted peace. For Center, for the neighborhood, for every person who'd felt their voice didn't matter. And as the first kids gathered at the lake's edge, fishing rods in hand, laughter returning to the shoreline like sunlight breaking through clouds, I realized sometimes justice doesn't wear a uniform. Sometimes it just buys the lake. About a month later, the lakefront looked nothing like it had before. Gone were the no fishing signs, the tacky authorized access only warnings Cassandra had nailed into the trees, and the stale tension that once hung in the air like humidity. In their place, kids running through the grass, neighbors chatting over folding chairs and picnic blankets, and the soft plop of fishing lines cast into the water. We held the first Community Lake Day on a Saturday morning. Not an HOA-sponsored event, just a gathering, organic, real. Samuel brought hand-painted signs showing which fish species were safe to release and which were best for catch and eat. Merrick grilled burgers on a portable smoker he'd bought just for the occasion. And Sen? She stood at the lakeside, teaching a 6-year-old how to hook bait, grinning so hard I thought her cheeks might split. It was the first time in months that I'd felt something close to peace. But it wasn't just the lake that had changed. The audit of the HOA finances uncovered everything we suspected and more. Cassandra had spent nearly $120,000 of association funds over 5 years on consulting services with companies that didn't exist. One supposed landscaping contractor shared a bank account with her cousin. Nearly $40,000 had been billed under community improvement design studies, most of which were just mock-ups for her private development ambitions. And perhaps the most damning, a $6,500 legal retainer that turned out to be an advance to a law firm that handled her real estate deals. Residents who once feared her began demanding accountability. Lawsuits were filed. Depositions were scheduled. Her home, formerly the jewel of the lakefront, sat empty, a for sale sign rusting in the grass. No buyers, of course. Everyone in town knew the name Cassandra Peterson now, and no one wanted to inherit her legacy. And yet, despite everything, I didn't feel victorious. I hadn't set out to win. I'd set out to protect, to stand up for what was right, to give Sen a place she could grow up in without fear, a home she could be proud of. So when the local high school civics teacher asked if I'd be willing to come speak to her class about community organizing and property rights, I said yes. I even smiled when she introduced me as the guy who bought the lake. Because it wasn't about the lake, not really. It was about what it represented: freedom, fairness, the refusal to be ruled by fear disguised as policy. That evening, after the Lake Day crowd had packed up and gone home, and the sun dipped low behind the trees, I sat on the same weathered bench Rachel and I had installed years ago. Sen curled up next to me with a blanket draped over her knees, watching fireflies dance above the water. She would have loved this, I said quietly, eyes fixed on the lake's still surface. She'd be proud of you, Sen whispered. I turned to her, watching her small fingers braid a blade of grass. Of us, I corrected gently. She'd be proud of us. The next week, a reporter from a local news blog reached out, wanting to cover the story. I declined the interview, but sent a short written statement. When one person abuses a system long enough, people forget they have power. This lake, this story, It's not about revenge. It's about remembering that you don't have to live under someone else's thumb just because they wrote the rules. You can write your own. And that's what we did. Fall settled into Lakeside quietly. The trees shed their leaves in slow, golden waves, blanketing the walking paths and painting the surface of the lake with rich copper and amber hues. Mornings grew crisp. You could hear the snap of frost underfoot and smell chimney smoke curling from homes that once seemed divided, but now felt stitched together with something that resembled community. There were no HOA meetings anymore, at least not the kind Cassandra used to weaponize. The board had been dissolved. A new interim council was voted in through a transparent process. This time, it wasn't lawyers and property flippers. It was librarians, school teachers, retirees, and even two college students home for break. The rules were being rewritten by the people who actually lived here, not those who sought to profit from control. As for the lake, it became a sanctuary. What was once a pawn in Cassandra's real estate scheme had transformed into a living classroom, a place where kids could learn about freshwater ecosystems, adults could find quiet reflection, and families could simply exist without suspicion. I donated part of my land to establish the Rachel Adams Environmental Center. Just a small cabin with solar panels, a few benches, and a dock rebuilt with local volunteers. We installed rain gardens to help filter runoff, introduced native plants to revive the shoreline, and began stocking the water with healthy fish species. Samuel organized monthly cleanup events. Merrick hosted free legal clinics to help residents review housing laws and protect themselves from future abuse. One chilly November afternoon, as dusk colored the horizon in faded lavender and gray, I found myself standing at the end of the dock, fishing rod in hand, not for the catch, but for the ritual, the quiet, the stillness that once felt impossible here. Sen joined me, two hot chocolates in hand. She had grown in ways I couldn't measure, not just taller, but stronger, sharper. She carried herself differently now, like she belonged, like she trusted the world a little more. "I overheard Ms. Kaplan at school," she said, handing me a cup. "She told another teacher that you're a local legend." I chuckled, shaking my head. "I'm just a guy who bought a lake to stop a bully." "You didn't just stop her," Sen said, looking out at the water. "You made everything better." I didn't answer right away. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter from across the water, someone skipping stones, a couple taking engagement photos near the weeping willow tree we'd replanted. A place once poisoned by control now bloomed with life again. "I didn't fix everything," I finally said, "but I made a crack big enough for sunlight to get in." She nodded. "It's more than most people ever do." A light breeze ruffled her hair. She leaned her head on my shoulder, and we sat in silence, watching the lake shimmer with the last light of the day. I thought about Rachel then, not in pain, not in memory, but in presence. I imagined her smile somewhere in that golden reflection on the water, not just proud, but at peace. Sometimes you fight because you're angry. Sometimes you fight because you're afraid. But the most powerful battles, the ones that last, that heal, are the ones you fight because you love what's on the line. And this place, these people, this lake, it was always worth it.